A very warm welcome to our special event at the margins of the thematic discussions on Pillar 2 of the Kyoto Declaration on Stop Non-State Torture, Enforce Human Rights for Everyone, co-sponsored by Honduras and Finland. We are very grateful to both governments for their support to this initiative, as well as our colleagues from CSU. Welcome, Anders and Billy. It is an honor for me to welcome you on behalf of the Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice in the room and online. And I will moderate as the coordinator of the working group on gender-based violence inflicted by non-state actors, which was established in August 21 by the Alliance. The event is going to take stock of the work we have already done and to discuss concrete steps that can be undertaken to address gender-based violence as a form of non-state torture and to advance the recognition of non-state torture in human rights instruments. What have we done so far? Firstly, we focused on an analysis of the current documents and literature. We have summarized our findings in a background paper and developed a statement which clarifies our key points for discussion. Emphasis is placed on gender-based violence as a form of non-state torture. You can find a collection of background materials on the website of the Alliance, crimealliance.org. The Alliance is hosting a page for the working group of non-state torture. In the process, we started engaging a dialogue with member states, recognize non-state torture to ensure full application of human rights for everyone. With the support of Honduras and Finland, we organized a side event on the occasion of the 31st session of the UN Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice in May 2020 in Vienna, and an art exhibition in the rotunda of the Vienna International Center in November 22. There were some programs left, it's on the table. Let's move now. Several Vienna-based diplomats have expressed an interest in our initiative. We believe that time is ripe to advance towards the development of a more formal document, a declaration on non-state torture to be submitted to member states for their consideration. Let's move now to our first speaker, as in the program listed, Dr. Yulisa Villanueva, Undersecretary of Security of Honduras. Due to very urgent commitments, she cannot join us today, but we have the pleasure of having Sandra Pons, the Counselor of the Mission of Honduras, with us, who will present the speech on her behalf. Sandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Inge. First of all, good afternoon, everyone.
Oh, sorry.
At the outset, allow me thank you on behalf of the Mission of Honduras, the opportunity to be part of this event. I want to convene the apologies of the Ambassador Freite. She wants us to be here, but due to the previous commitment, she couldn't make it. And I want to excuse, of course, the Undersecretary Villanueva. She's with COVID, fortunately. That's why she couldn't deliver the statement. So as Inge mentioned, I will deliver this statement on behalf of the Undersecretary Villanueva. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, representatives of civil society, friends, everyone. At the beginning of my statement, let me thank the co-organizers of this site event, the government of Finland and the Vienna-based Alliance of Civil Society Organization on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. I also want to thank my fellow co-panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, for me, it's an honor and a privilege to be part of this discussion on behalf of the state of Honduras, representing the government of President Xiomara Castro, the first woman to govern Honduras, and for whom gender equality and the protection of the women's rights is a high priority. Gender violence is in different forms, as all we know, the most widespread of human rights violation. My undersecretary has a specific mandate on this area to combat all forms of gender violence. This is the third time that I have the opportunity to be part of a discussion on the need to stop torture as a form of gender violence against women and girls from armed non-state actors. On the first occasion, I have the privilege of chairing the panel with Rashida Manjoo, former Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, who visited Honduras from the 1st to 8th of July 2014. Let me cite some of the Special Rapporteur's findings during her visit to Honduras regarding gender-based violence inflicted by non-state actors such as maras, gangs, and organized crime. The Special Rapporteur highlighted in her report that 60% of acts of gender violence against women and girls were linked to organized crime, maras, gangs, and drugs traffickers and human traffickers. The Special Rapporteur described in her report how the levels of violence exacerbated by maras and gangs reflect forms of sexual violence and torture emanating from these groups. The report also refers to the transnational violence in the context of migration and the treatment of the victims of trafficking in human beings. The Special Rapporteur also, the visit of the Special Rapporteur took place almost a decade ago. I would like to say that things have improved since then. Unfortunately, it's not like that. This is why being part and contributing to this discussion is so important for Honduras and for the government of the President Xiomara Castro. In the first panel that I have during the CCPCJ, I share with you my experience as a forensic doctor, how the bodies of women and girls speak and say that some had been tortured before being killed or mutilated. The perpetrators are not state actors. They are arms groups, they are gangs, they are organized crime, but they are not punished as a tortures, and their victims are not repaired as the victims of tortures. The Special Rapporteur also recommends in her report to improve our collection of information to make evidence-based policies. We cannot longer ignore or underestimate these forms of violence, torture against women that amount to 60% of cases, as indicated by the Special Rapporteur in her report. An effective institutional response requires scientific information on the nature and magnitude of this phenomenon. This violence is increasing. That is why Honduras believes that on the importance of the declaration, and we will continue being part of this discussion to understand well what is the best response to end the torture from non-state actors. We would like to conclude to highlight that we consider there are open questions, the notion of state actors, for example, and we would like to leave this question our co-panelists. We ask if we should include every non-state actors, including the family, or this notion should be limited to the non-state armed actors, such as maras, pandillas, and organized crime. I leave this for the panelists, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Sandra. And I would like to turn to the next speaker. It is Otto Korhonen. He serves as advisor to the permanent representative of Finland to the UN in Vienna, responsible at the working level for UNODC, UNOOCA, and UNCITRAL related matters. Please, Otto, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Hämäläinen unfortunately is not available due to conflicting schedules, but I am more than happy to deliver these remarks myself. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, Allow me to express my gratitude to you, Ms. Anna Alvazzi del Frate and Ms. Ingeborg Gaia from the Alliance of NGOs for giving Finland a chance to address the event. Many thanks to Honduras for taking initiative on this issue. Thank you, Ms. Sandra Ponce, for being with us here today. I would also like to thank all the panelists with the deep expertise for being with us. And finally, I appreciate everyone here in the audience for taking the time, your precious time, and dedicating it to this important issue. The Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice has consistently promoted global awareness to end non-state torture, crimes against women and girls. Our expert, Mr. Arne Kinnunen, had the pleasure to moderate the side event during the CCPCJ 31st session of the CCPCJ in May. Recently, we were pleased to experience the thought-provoking exhibition organized by the Alliance here at the Vienna International Center. The government of Finland supports work to raise awareness about non-state torture. As we stated last month at the opening of the exhibition, torture in law and in academic texts does not necessarily translate to social consciousness. Yet, awareness raising is a prerequisite for action. Therefore, events like this have tremendous value. Some forms of torture are indeed linked to gender-based violence. It is clearly stated in the 2016 report by the Special Rapporteur on Torture that female genital mutilation, child enforced marriage, and honor-based violence are acknowledged as forms of gender-based violence that constitute ill treatment and torture. The Finnish government of Prime Minister Sanna Marin, who, by the way, was recently labeled as fearless leader by the Financial Times, as a side note, she has taken measures to prevent gender-based violence, including many of the aspects mentioned in the aforementioned Special Rapporteur's report. First, an action plan for combating violence against women for 2020 to 2023 was drafted. Measures in the action plan include, among other things, awareness-raising activities, training of professionals, and enhancing programs directed to perpetrators. Many of the measures target honor-based violence in particular. The government has also initiated a process to alter the legislation to allow for the annulment of all sorts of forced marriages and child marriages. The bill regarding this is currently being debated in the Parliament of Finland. The narrow character of the definition of torture deserves more attention internationally. Finland, like most states, is a party to the UN Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment. As we heard from Ms. Linda MacDonald and Ms. Jean Sarson during the side event in May, the specific acts of torture between state and non-state actors are of similar nature. Despite this, the acts are treated differently due to the different status of the perpetrators. Such interpretation of torture contains a clear gap. It excludes acts of torture perpetrated by, for instance, criminal groups or terrorist groups. Yet, from a victim's point of view, there is not a major difference whether the torture derives from state actors or non-state actors. Torture is a very heinous crime and a human rights offense, which we must treat seriously and classify appropriately. I look forward to interventions by various experts on best ways to achieve progress on ending non-state torture crimes. In addition, we need strong input from the international community to help states in their efforts to put an end to non-state torture. The Alliance has stated that the Declaration on Non-State Torture would empower states to fulfill their obligation at all levels to protect, prevent, investigate, prosecute, and hold to account the perpetrators of all forms of torture and eliminate impunity, as well as provide for effective access to appropriate protection, remedies, and reparations on a national basis for victims and survivors in order to avoid re-victimization and to promote an empowering environment. We also see value in a United Nations declaration on this topic. I thank you for your attention, and perhaps I'll come back to the question posed by Sandra a little bit later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Otto, for this encouraging speech and the best practice examples from Finland. I would now like to turn over to our next speakers, Jean and Linda, the lead substantive experts of our working group, founders of Persons Against Non-State Actors, authors of the book Women Unsilenced, and many publications over 3 decades of grassroots research, awareness raising, and campaigning. They were flying in from Canada. Thank you for joining us in person to this event. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So we want to answer the question, why do we need a declaration on non-state torture? And if we follow what's been said in the last 2.5 days, we're talking about a people-centered, a victim-centered need. And what we have is the voices of thousands of women who've told us that they want their crime to be named as non-state torture. So for Jean and I, that's why we want a declaration on non-state torture for the women who've shared their stories with us. And they're really the most invisible victims. Their perpetrators are the most invisible perpetrators. It's the most unrecognized and unreported crime globally, the crime of non-state torture, in particular by families. And that's the population that Jean and I have been working with, families. Their perpetrators are parents. You can change to the next slide. Next slide. Their parents are the perpetrators. They're, as you see listed there. Oh, sorry, I'm looking in the wrong place. So the perpetrators are parents and uncles and aunts and grandmothers and grandfathers. And they use torture in particular so that they can traffic the children. That's their primary goal, is they use torture as a tool to traffic. So that's the behavior or the actions. And the actions of torture that they use are the same as in state. Water torture, drugging, electric shocking is very common, gang rape, deprivations of cold and food. So we're talking about extreme actions here that families perpetrate against their children. They do it so that they can't remember in the drugging. They do it so that they're so terrified and captive from the time they're infants, because we're talking about a crime that starts from infancy onward, that they never dare tell anyone. They do it so that they can use them as drug traffickers themselves. Some of the women were told and forced to traffic drugs, like we heard about this morning. I think it was a case in Finland where a child was seen as a victim because her parents, or he didn't give the gender of the child, but the child was forced to sell drugs. Well, these women tell us the same stories as teenagers. They were forced to sell drugs in the high schools to their friends. And the perpetrators are very intentional in their actions. There's never a mistake if you're having a child and you're torturing that child so that you can traffic them. So it's a very intentional crime. And it's still, like I said, much too invisible. Another reason we would like the declaration is because it's a way to prevent femicide, because femicide is the ultimate crime. And the crime of human trafficking can result in femicide, and the crime of torture can as well. So as you see on the slide there, the perpetrators, they victimize their daughters, their sisters, their spouses, because some of the women weren't born into the families. They married men who they thought were the perfect man, and then ended up being tortured and trafficked into prostitution and into pornography as well. And the children are involved in a lot of cybercrime pornography. The parents make money that way as well. So it's a relational issue with the work that Jean and I do, The torturers are a very intimate relationship with the victims. They deliberately often have the children so that they can torture and traffic them. They don't have them because they love them. They have them so that they can brutalize them and make money off them. So it's a form of captivity and terrorization that the women that come to us are often in their late 20s to mid 30s, even sometimes in their age of 50 before they dare to tell, because they've been so conditioned not to share what really happened to them. And the key thing is that they value that we believe them. And that's what we're here to do, is to share their stories and ask you to believe them and ask you to respect their voice and recognize that they have indeed endured torture and human trafficking and grave suffering, and that they need recognition of that and a society that will provide care, because the care that they deserve is different than abuse. You know, with state torture, they need a specific kind of care, and it's exactly the same with non-state torture. Jean and I work with both abuse survivors and torture survivors, and the torture survivors need a different form of care. So they need the crime recognized for them to get the right care. And with that, I'll pass it over to Jean. Thank you.
I'm going to try very quickly to put a face on when we say it's people-centered. These are images of people that we have come to know quite intimately in various ways. Some of them, if you went to the exhibition, you will recognize their faces, and others are very new. And the reason we're putting their faces and images there, when we talk about a woman or a child or an infant, it can be quite abstract. And this is what we want to break, the abstraction that goes on. So I will start very quickly at the top next to the flyer that you have. There's the two women there. They were part of the exhibition. One was Wanda, she's a Canadian. The other is Elizabeth Gordon, and she's from the UK. So this is a global issue, and we'll try to make it as global as possible, accenting Honduras, who has talked so deeply about what happens to women in Honduras. So both of those women were born into families that started torturing and trafficking them from infancy. And the more formal trafficking, human trafficking, started with Wanda at the age of 2. So the issue of non-state torture is a complex addition to other crimes too. So not only were her parents torturing her, they do it for pleasure. We cannot forget that there's pleasure in the perpetrators who exert such brutality. So, and the same with Elizabeth. There were informal networks, and her mother and father were both involved, plus an uncle. And trafficking, we forget sometimes that it doesn't have to be out of the house. As children, they were told that they were having parties, and their parents would invite the other torturers into their house. And for Wanda, she had what she called a torture room in her parents' house, where they gathered and brought other perpetrators into the house and had a party. That was coded language. So next to Sarah is a little baby, and we came to know her through a teenager. When she was a teenager, she had this little girl, Louise, and when she was an adult woman, she had to try to integrate this memory. And if you look at Louise, Louise was being tortured and trafficked also, and tortured. And you can see in her legs, it looks like her legs are broken, and she had injury to her face. And what Linda was saying were that the treatment for recovery and healing for a woman who has such horror takes a long time. So in the event to try to heal, her mother, who was by the time she contacted us, was in her late 40s. And Louise was born when she was 16, and she was an unregistered child. And in the end, Louise was murdered through a group. And how we came to know that, her mother contacted us, and this is through the internet. And what happens when you've been horrified and tortured and terrorized, you can only release so much information at a time, because if you release too much, you can't cope with it. So what she would do, her mother would send us a couple sentences in an email, and that happened over many, many months. And eventually we had a statement. We put it together and we sent it to the woman. She's from the EU. And she took it to her therapist, and eventually they processed the horror that she had experienced. They went to the police. The police found evidence, and that it was her uncle who was one of the prime non-state torturers and traffickers. And the police tried to arrest him, but he committed suicide before they did. So when you think about children, we want you to know that we're talking babies. When babies are brought to your attention, remember that they're a human being and they suffered terribly. The next woman, she was dehumanized in prostitution. She said it took her 7 years before she realized the dehumanization, and she was part of the exhibition. There's another baby there. Her name was Judith. And the reason we have baby pictures is the perpetrators have many different tools. And if you were at the exhibition, you'll know some of the, like the belts and the drugging, but they also use pictures of babies like this to send to the adult women and say, you were guilty of this crime, because that's how perpetrators make other people feel guilty. So they'd send the pictures and say, remember, you're part of this. It's a way to keep them silent and never telling. And the other little girl is 2-year-old Sarah. And it's Christmas time, and that's a Christmas picture. And for her, she was the present. That meant that her Christmas was spent being victimized, tortured and trafficked, and a Christmas party. The young woman next to her is from Papua New Guinea, where their tradition has witch burning. Her mother was tortured and then burnt to death, and she's 6 years old. And we have a connection in Papua New Guinea, a woman, Lily, who is working hard trying to help culture understand that torturing is a human rights crime. And the two people underneath that, the woman that's a bit hazy, she is a Canadian, and she was in the residential school, and she talks, she's a native Métis, and she was in the residential schools in Canada, where in some schools they were tortured. The next young woman next to her, young girl, when Otto brought up child marriage, she was so-called a child bride. But when they tried to prostitute her, she resisted. So they kept her locked in a basement and tortured her, pulled her nails out, pulled her hair out, burnt her, starved her. And when she was found, she could hardly speak. And under the bottom was the UNODC brings up domestic workers and their employers can be torturers, and you see she's hospitalized. The next woman is Jeanette. She's from the US, and she was born into a family that tortured her. The next two and trafficked her, and she escaped around 25. The next two images are of drawings, and sometimes women cannot tell their story. They can draw an image and then they can start to explain to us what the image means. So the first image is about being isolated, confined in a room, all alone, powerless, and that's Karen. She was from Germany. The next image is electric shocking. She is from the United States and her name was Shell. The next image is of Alex. She was a Canadian and she fled Canada into the United States in order to try to save herself. She felt if she stayed in Canada that her parent, her father, would certainly kill her. And she was trafficked more locally to 3 other male perpetrators. And a lot of these men are powerful men. So they have that against them too, to try to tell their story and be believed. Very quickly, I know I've limited time. The next person, Caroline with the glasses, she married a man and he progressed to torture and trafficked her. And she talked about having some of her body tissue cut off. And above her in the image of black and white is Lynn. She is from our town in Nova Scotia, Canada. And she was groomed by a man for 6 months, married. And all the time that the grooming was going on, her husband was working with 3 other men. Their plan was to hold her captive and torture and exploit her. And that's exactly what happened. It took her 4.5 years before she escaped. And the next slide was again of a domestic worker and the torture. And that is to put a face on the reality that when we're talking about non-state torture, it's a very complex crime. It often is associated with other crimes, in this case, in human trafficking, in child marriage, in pornographic victimization, and of infants. And I think that's my time.
Thank you, Jean and Linda, for this very sad presentation, which leaves us with very uncomfortable feelings, but encourage us to go forward with this topic. And now we will try to connect online with our next speaker, Eduardo Vettere, Executive Secretary of the 8th, 9th, and 11th UN Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice Congresses, former Director of the Division for Treaty Affairs of UNODC, and a strong supporter of our working group. Eduardo, I do hope you are able to speak now.
Good morning, everyone. Excellencies, distinguished delegates, dear colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be also on this occasion with you to shed some lights on what avenues we may have in order to try to provide some practical action to the efforts on which the international community is engaged in order to provide, first of all, remedies and access to justice to all victims of violence and torture by non-state actors. As everybody knows, there are several avenues, starting, of course, with the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice here in Vienna, but there are also other bodies, as you know, dealing with this, starting with the Human Rights Council. There is a special rapporteur on torture, which reports there, in addition to also reporting later on to the General Assembly. And since I mentioned the General Assembly, of course, there is also the possibility of taking action on the part of interested member states directly in the third committee of the General Assembly, which is dealing with social and social development, human rights, crime, drugs, etc., where there are also a number of items under which particular action can be taken, starting from the item on advancement of women, continuing on with other items on the right of the child, going on with the items on torture, to the other item on crime prevention and criminal justice, all matters discussed by the third committee every year, even if some of relevant resolutions, those are taken on a biennial basis, as the one dealing with torture. So in a sense, there are options that can be tested and can be used depending on the joint efforts on the part of member states for some very practical action to deal with this problem. Now, why it is important and why it is the time to take some more urgent action on those issues. As the paper that has been presented for this meeting demonstrates, there are very, very important reasons, and times have changed since the time, for the first time, the General Assembly adopted a declaration against regarding the protection of all persons from being subjected to torture or other cruel and inhumane and degrading treatment, in declaration adopted in 1975 on the basis of the recommendations made by the 5th United Nations Congress held in Geneva a few years earlier. As it is mentioned on the paper, of course, torture is already contemplated in Article 5 of the Declaration of Human Rights. More or less the same language is used in Article 7 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. But all this was not considered sufficient, and this is why, because of the changing time and the changing circumstances, the international community adopted the declaration on 75, declaration that almost 10 years later gave the possibility for, after several years of negotiation, for the adoption of the Convention Against Torture and other inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment. So it is on the basis also of all these actions that also special rapporteurs were established by the human rights bodies, reporting, as I mentioned now, to the Council of the Human Rights Council and the General Assembly. And but I would like to also mention something and stress something which is very important in order to demonstrate the urgency for action on this level. In the paper that has been submitted, mention is made to a joint statement of independent experts that was agreed just some time ago by independent experts. Now we have to mention these independent experts was not a small group. They were more than 40 independent experts and mandates procedures holders of the Human Rights Council who joined in order to issue the statement which is very important and which demonstrates that not only on the part of the Special Rapporteur against torture, but also on all other relevant rapporteurs and chairman or members of special procedures of the Human Rights Council issued this statement. So the matter is urgent, the matter is important, and is more important considering the consideration that times have changed, comparing those times with those which in which first the declaration for all persons to being subjected to torture and other human rights, and after the convention in 1984 were adopted. Times have changed because criminality has become much more rampant. Organized crime of every time there is a convention against international organized crime with 3 protocols. The protection of victims is something which is very important there, and I think that this requires some very considerate action on the part of member states. Let's also not forget that there is a declaration of basic principles of justice for victims of crime and abuse of power, in which the importance of victims protection and not only victims but also relatives and survivors is not only stressed, but member states are urgent to take action to protect their dignity. So to do justice against victims, to continue to have countries which are respectful of the rule of law and which are keen also to implement whatever is required for reaching the goals and the various targets of the SDGs, is important that joint efforts are being made by member states with, of course, the support and collaboration and cooperation of outside experts, civil society, academia, in order to take finally more practical action in order to deal with this problem. Thank you for your attention and best wishes for the success of the meeting.
Thank you, Eduardo, for this summary of what we should do or what we can do, all the options we will have. The documents you mentioned, you can find also on the website of crimealliance.org under what we do /non-state torture. So if you would be interested to go deeper in these details, it is possible now. I thank you again and would like to give the floor now to Anna to summarize our work. Anna Alvazzi del Frate is the 2019-2023 chair of the Alliance of NGOs on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice. Anna, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Inge. Thank you. I would like to thank all the speakers who have brought into this room all the burden of this topic. What we are trying to do with the working group established at the Alliance and with this initiative is to try to do something concrete to advance. Maybe the first slide, the next slide can explain. We started, Eduardo explained it very, very well, from a very broad concept of torture that was included in 1948 in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, to a narrower definition that was in the 1984 Convention on Torture. So we have heard here about the what, about these type of acts, the severe pain or suffering, physical, mental, etc. We have heard the for what, so the implication of these acts being as a punishment, as intimidation, as a form of coercion, so always implying a power relationship between perpetrator and victim. But the perpetrator is narrowly defined in the convention as a public official, so a state actor. Why is this important? It is important because this framework, the framework is a form of protection, human rights protection. And what is happening now, next slide please, is that times have changed. Eduardo has repeated this several times, and I would like to put a couple of more elements here. One is that conflict that in the past was an important element for the formulation of the concept of torture because it was used to extort confessions from prisoners, for example. The form of conflict that used to be in the past between states is really very rare nowadays. The majority of conflicts is what Sandra mentioned before, is forms of organized crime, gangs. We have heard about the maras, we have heard about human traffickers. So this is the type of conflict that communities experience every day and that are involved in a lot of crimes that may be defined as forms of torture. And the second point is that this concept is being received in domestic legislation because some states realize and they are so under pressure for these things that they have already moved in this direction, especially, next slide please, within the framework of gender-based violence. In particular, we know that there are a number of Latin American and Caribbean countries that have adopted specific legislation on femicide. They have defined femicide as an offense in criminal code. And some of these countries have gone beyond the traditional concept of femicide as a form of domestic intimate partner violence. And here, this citation from the UNODC Global Study on Homicide, as you can see, includes the word torture. So it is already written in a UNODC publication that gender-based violence can be considered as a form of torture and is being dealt as such in some countries, as in some domestic legislation. So next slide, please. Concretely, this is just really brainstorming, so a few ideas about what next. In particular, what we would like to do is to promote really a broader application of the anti-torture framework so that it's not limited to state actors, that it includes non-state actors as promoted by the experts that have been cited by Eduardo, as we see already happening in some domestic legislation. So these good practice of domestic legislation could be really promoted to expand the concept of further in more countries. And for example, practically it would be possible to convene a group of experts that they could perhaps reflect on model legislation that could be serving this purpose. So thank you very much. Thank you for being here. And I think we are really privileged to have the help of some states who are also helping us to get the ball rolling. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. This concludes the list of speakers. We have a clear idea now on the challenges ahead. And there is still some time for questions. And please raise your hands here or on the online. I see can we, do we have some in the chat? I suppose Eduardo is still Colombia. Thank you.
Thank you to you, to the NGO Alliance, to Honduras and Finland for the organization of this event and for bringing to our attention this important issue. I have some questions. The first one is, why a declaration and not other form? It could be a protocol or it could be, let's say, different approaches. So why is the best way to move forward on this issue to have a declaration? And the idea is to have a declaration, if I'm not wrong, by certain states within the framework of the Human Rights Council. It is that, or I am wrong. The second one is, what is the expected relationship between this declaration and other international instruments, not only the Convention against Torture, but for example, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women, or our United Nations Convention against Transnational Organized Crime and the Protocol on Trafficking in Persons. How do we expect that this declaration will fit in these other instruments that we have? And also, the aim is to just change the definition, not change, but to promote the understanding that the definition on torture will go beyond state actors, but not other elements of the definition included in the Convention Against Torture will be changed, or I am not getting the idea. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Who would like to? Perhaps we take the other question from Venezuela.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the organizers, in particular to Finland and Honduras, for the idea. We just, first of all, it was very interesting, it was very moving also, and it's a big concern for us to know that this exists. And as we could see, there are like mainly two forms, and one of those is very related to the work we do here in UNODC. That is the one that involves organized crime in the torture, not from states, but organized crime organization. How can we help from the UNODC? How can we translate this concern to our job here? That is my first question. In the same line as Colombia, I think just a declaration probably does not go as far as we could, because in this case, maybe our state cannot be very aware of this situation and may not be moved to be included in this declaration. But there are other forms that we can reach and try to help, and that is by joining any other form that maybe the states that have been helping with this can put in front of us to work with within the UNODC, at least with what is referred to the organized crime in torture. And my second question is regarding the how do you think we can translate this into some sort of raise awareness in all states. As you know, that many times we in the governments just look at what is going on in the international organizations and translate it into national law. But the opposite is also true. We have in place in our local governments ideas that then we try to bring it here and make it a little bit broader. How can we help from those two perspectives? How can we have an international recognition of this situation and bring it home? And how can we, if we have a national legislation on this regard, how can we just put it forward for other countries' consideration? Thank you so much.
Thank you for this very interesting questions and for discussion. Is there any other question online? No? Then I would like, who would like to? Yeah, Eduardo, can you, he is online. I see him. Perhaps you are able to speak now? He's muted, yeah. Can you
hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I don't know why before it didn't work and now it works. But I think that no doubt some very good questions have been posed by our distinguished delegates from Colombia and Venezuela. And the fact that, of course, the possibility of having an additional protocol, either to the Torture Convention or of course, the relationship between non-state actors looking at all the underworld of organized crime, terrorism also, traffickers of persons, women and girls. I think that the examples could continue. Already in the provisions of the Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime, there are relevant provisions in order for a full protection to be provided to the victims of such crimes. So I think that the convention is quite clear on this. Of course, not going into details in the various typology of non-state actors or criminal organized group committing such crimes. No doubt also, I think that the observations provided by the distinguished delegates from Colombia of this kind of mutual feedback between what is happening at the international level and what is happening at the national level in order to provide a source of broad basis for international action. Also, this is quite relevant, and this is why what, for example, Anna Alvazzi did, mentioning some legislation already existing in some countries related to use torture on non-state actors as a serious crime is when committed by non-state actors is an important example of all this from which a national experience can be a source of inspiration for international action. Let's also not forget that the first resolution on femicide, speaking of gender violence, was adopted by the Commission, was adopted by the General Assembly on the recommendations of the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice a few years ago. Let's also not forget a very, very important, more recent draft resolutions being recommended for adoption by the General Assembly, recommended by the Third Committee for adoption by the General Assembly in connection with the item on the status of women, on violence against women and all forms of discrimination, in which for the first time also the term femicide is used, and the fact that there are specific measures being contemplated for member states to take more concrete action against this phenomena. So it's just a question of trying to be inspired by all what is happening in order to come up with some more concrete action. Now, whether it has to take the form of a declaration, whether it has to take the form of just a draft resolution to be recommended for further action by the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice, by the for the General Assembly, this is something on which interested member states can discuss. Another point also is the question of trying to work in the relevant bodies of human rights, in this case particularly with the Special Rapporteur against torture, but also with some of the others who are very sensible to this issue, in order to see the extent to which one can speak, for example, of an optional protocol related to the Convention on Torture, which would cover also the cases of non-state actors. But again, in order to do this, I think it's better, you know, a new protocol, the negotiations, the agreement it may take quite a lot of time. There is quite a lot of, you know, as any kind of international instruments would take much more time than simply a resolution in a form of a declaration, which gives enough importance to the issue, but at the same time is not so, let's say, an obligation for member states as it can be the form of a convention or an optional protocol to the convention. So all these are matters to be taken into consideration, and of course further consultation, particularly among interested member states, whether from the point of view of gender violence and femicide, or from the point of view of organized crime or terrorism, etc. All these are options that should be placed on the table, and see where a consensus is easier to emerge for some more concrete actions and practical measures. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Eduardo, for all these recommendations. We might follow up, and as time is already limited, I would like to invite the panelists for some comments.
I can respond to the issue of CEDAW. CEDAW, their general recommendation 35, they talk about the issue of torture, including non-state. But the issue with general recommendations is they're soft law and countries can just ignore them. And the same thing with UN-CAT, because like as Eduardo said, it's very focused on state actors. So their general comment number 2 in paragraph 18 does talk about non-state actors, but here again it's soft law and countries can just ignore it. So there's not even the possibility to create awareness where a declaration is trying to promote awareness. So the voices of those who we've presented and who are victimized around the world know that they're not totally invisible. And the same with the Committee Against Torture. Here again, just like the UN-CAT, here again, it's soft law and doesn't create the awareness because it can be ignored. Those suggestions or my comments are based also on personal experience, having gone to the committee and gone to CEDAW, and that's what the outcome was.
Thank you, Jean. May I?
Could I say so? I'd like to just add a thought around the organized crime. Really, the families that we're talking about, they fit in under organized crime anyways, because they're criminal informal networks. So the umbrella of organized crime would fit for most of the non-state torture, except for child brides and, you know, that type of cultural. But certainly the families that we've come to know are organized, not in a highly organized way, but they're certainly criminal informal networks. So that's just one other thought I wanted to add.
Otto?
Yes, thank you. And I would like to thank the distinguished representatives of Colombia and Venezuela for their comments and questions. One thing I would highlight on this issue is that for Finland, our legislation concerning torture is based on the UN CAT, as has been mentioned here, and that directly excludes non-state actors. From when we think about further whether whether we need a declaration or something else, declaration would be a step forward. That doesn't have to be the end result. Then we can address something, but we would need some kind of an international document, black on white, so that we can say that we keep to our international obligations. Because right now, if we were to alter this definition, it could also be, in some cases, against the UN CAT that defines torture as something committed by a public official. So there is a problem there. Thanks.
Thank you. Sandra, please.
Brief. Okay, I also want to thank Colombia and Venezuela for their interesting questions. From my side, I just would say that it's very important, and this is a very fundamental step to assume that we have this form of violence. Is torture, as the Undersecretary mentioned in her statement. She had experience as a pathologist, so she saw the bodies of the girls, of the women, and I think it's important that we assume that this is torture, even in the convention do not consider as a torture. Another element, I think, is this dynamic between the national framework and the international framework. I think international is more about cooperate to address some challenges that we share. But I think we can start at the national level, as the examples that Anna shared with us, assuming this. We are experiencing, is the case of my country, this form of violence coming from the guns, coming from the organized crime, and we need to be radical here, because it's sometimes difficult to, when we start this event, I was a bit conservative about non-state actors, to assume family members are non-state actors, but after listening to you, now I am questioning myself, because I think that the portrayed violence that the woman experience or the girls experience is actually a form of torture as well, but it's sometimes difficult to see it like that. So I think this is the first step at the national level. We have progress, and I think we can move internationally. Maybe it will need a convention, because as you said, the resolution of the Human Rights Council, even a declaration, if it's a resolution of the General Assembly, will not be binding, will be a soft law still. So we will, but now we have a problem. We know that we have to find a response to this. And I think what we have to continue working is how we will find this way, which kind of instrument. Thank you.
Anna, please. Thank
No, thank you very much. Thank you for this very, very important discussion. So thank you all for the questions. And indeed, I think we can add to our collection of questions now two very important points. The delegate from Venezuela asked, what can we do to bring it closer? Actually, this reflection on the criminal groups. So what is a criminal group under UNTOC? And this is something very important to try to reflect exactly how times have changed also from that point of view. So this is one thing. And the second point is this relationship between domestic and international. Of course, we can start domestic, and I think this is a very important aspect, but the need to bring this to the international level is to agree and to make sure that there are no safe havens for these type of criminals. We should bear in mind the human traffickers as an example, you know, so that obviously if there was no convention and no almost universal ratification, there would be still the possibility to do this without being punished. Impunity is what we have to fight, and this is really the importance of bringing this to the international level. So thank you all.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you all for this very inspiring comments on this issue, and we are encouraged to go forward, and we would like to be allowed to invite Colombia and Venezuela and other member states who expressed already their interest in joining us to bringing forward this topic to a more official document. Thank you all very much and enjoy the day on the afternoon session in the fourth floor. Thank you.